The third time he dragged himself up the porch steps, she finally saw the leg, or what was left of it. It wasn't a leg, not really. It was a twisted, fur-matted question mark, held on by sheer will and a few tendons, dangling uselessly from his bony ginger hip. He didn't walk. He hauled. A desperate, three-pointed lurch that was all shoulder, then good back leg, then a painful-sounding thud of his chest hitting the ground. Over and over. The sound was what got to her first, even before she saw the full shape of him in the dim evening light. A scrape, a thump, a long, quiet sigh. Then the scrape and thump again, like someone slowly pushing a bag of rocks up a hill. Alara heard it from her kitchen, through the screen door she kept unlatched for the cross-breeze that never really came. The air was thick and wet, the kind of late summer humidity that felt like a wool blanket pulled tight over your mouth. It was the third night in a row she'd heard it. The first night, she'd thought it was a possum, maybe a raccoon with a caught trap, something she should ignore. The second night, she'd peered through the blinds, saw a flash of orange and a shape that moved all wrong, and her stomach had clenched. She'd turned away. She didn't need another problem. Her own were taking up all the room. But this third night, she couldn't turn away. The scraping was slower. The sighs between the thumps were longer. She stood at the sink, her hands deep in lukewarm dishwater, and she listened. Her own breath felt shallow in her chest, a tight, anxious feeling she'd carried for months, a permanent souvenir from the day the divorce papers were finalized. The house was too quiet, a monument to a life that had suddenly and very loudly ended. David was gone. The friends had faded, unsure which party to belong to. It was just her, and the echoing rooms, and the crushing weight of a future she hadn't planned on, and now this sound on her porch. She turned off the faucet. The silence that rushed in was heavier than the humidity. And in that silence, the next thump sounded like a gunshot. She wiped her hands on her jeans, her heart doing a nervous little tap dance against her ribs. She walked to the back door, her bare feet silent on the cool linoleum. She didn't turn on the porch light. She didn't want to scare whatever it was away. She just wanted to see, to know. She peered through the screen, and there he was. A mess of orange and white fur, matted with dirt and what looked like sap. He was skin and bones, his ribs a stark cage under his patchy coat. His face was turned away from her, focused on the task of getting his broken body up onto the second step. His one good back leg strained, muscles quivering with the effort. The damaged leg swung like a pendulum, hitting the wooden step with a soft, terrible tap. He made it. He paused, his whole body heaving with the effort to breathe. His head hung low. Then, as if he sensed her, he slowly, painfully, turned his head, and Alara felt the air leave her lungs. He had the widest, greenest eyes she had ever seen. They weren't just eyes. They were pools of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. There was no fear in them, no plea. Just a deep, ancient tiredness that seemed to look right through the screen door, right through her, and into the hollowed-out core of her own heart. It was the look of someone who had given up, but whose body kept moving out of some stubborn, forgotten habit. Their eyes held. The world shrunk down to the space between them. The dusty porch boards, the faded screen mesh, the thick, aching air. He didn't flinch. He didn't try to run. He just looked, as if he'd been expecting her. Alara's hand went to the door latch. Her fingers were trembling. "Don't," a voice in her head warned. It was the same voice that had told her not to answer David's last phone call. The same voice that told her to stay in bed all day. It's a stray. It's hurt. It's probably sick. It will be a burden. You can't handle a burden. You can't even handle yourself. The cat lowered his head again, a gesture of such profound defeat that it cracked something open inside her. Without another thought, her fingers found the latch and slid it open. The metal click was absurdly loud in the quiet. The sound made him flinch. He tried to back up, a panicked, clumsy motion that sent him tumbling off the step he'd just conquered. He landed in a heap on the dirt path below, a small, pathetic whimper escaping him. "Oh God, I'm sorry," Alara whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. I'm so sorry. She pushed the screen door open slowly, its whine another intrusion, in the quiet night. She took a hesitant step onto the porch. The worn wood was still warm from the day's sun. She could smell the damp earth from her neglected flower beds, and the faint, sour scent of fear coming from the cat. He'd managed to right himself, but he wasn't trying to run. He was just sitting there, in the dirt, looking up at her. His chest was moving too fast. He was terrified, but he was also too tired, too broken to flee. "It's okay," she murmured, kneeling down slowly, keeping her distance. She didn't want to loom over him. She felt a strange need to be on his level, to show him she wasn't a threat. "I'm not going to hurt you." He blinked at her slowly, a deliberate, trusting gesture that seemed at odds with his trembling body. She saw the full extent of his injury then. The leg was a disaster. It was clearly an old wound, long healed in the worst way possible. It had been broken, maybe by a car or a cruel person, and had just fused. It was bent at a horrifying angle, the paw twisted inward. He would never use it. He'd be dragging it behind him for the rest of his life. The rest of his life, which, if he stayed out here, wouldn't be long. The thought landed in her stomach like a stone. She looked at his face again. Those green eyes were fixed on her. He let out a small, quiet sound. Not a meow. It was softer than that. A chirp. A question. And in that moment, Alara saw it. A flicker. Not in the cat, but in the future. A flash of him, months from now. Not healed, but clean, fed, sleeping on a soft blanket in a patch of sun on her living room floor. The image was so vivid, so quiet and peaceful, that it stole her breath. It was the first time in a year she had imagined a future that didn't fill her with dread. It was just a flash, a seed. But it was enough. "Okay," she breathed out, the word barely a sound. She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. "Okay." She stayed there, kneeling on the porch, as the fireflies began to blink in the gathering darkness. The cat stayed in the dirt, watching her. Neither of them moved. The world was reduced to this silent, fragile understanding between two broken creatures. The scrape and thump had stopped. For now, there was only the sound of their breathing, slowly starting to sink up in the warm, dark air. Something had begun. You're here, listening. And that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. She didn't bring him inside that night. The thought was too big, too terrifying for both of them. Instead, she did the only thing that felt small enough to manage. She went back into her quiet, echoing kitchen, her heart still hammering against her ribs, and she filled a chipped yellow bowl with cold water. She rummaged in a cupboard, her hands finding a can of tuna she didn't remember buying, its metal cool and familiar under her fingers. She opened it, the sound sharp in the silence, and forked the flaky meat onto a small plate. The simple, mundane actions felt like a ritual, a quiet promise. She carried the offerings back to the door, moving slowly, her bare feet whispering on the floorboards. She half expected him to be gone, vanished back into the shadows from which he'd come. But he was still there. He had managed to haul himself back onto the first porch step, and he was sitting there, washed in the pale silver light of a rising moon, watching the door. Waiting. He didn't startle when she appeared. He just watched, his green eyes luminous in the dim light, his broken body a dark silhouette. Alara didn't step onto the porch. She didn't want to shatter this new, fragile thing. She set the bowl of water and the plate of tuna just outside the door, on the porch boards, right at the threshold. The space between her inside and his outside felt vast, a canyon of fear and past hurts. The food was a bridge. A tiny, trembling bridge. "There you go," she whispered, her voice still strange to her own ears. It was the most she'd spoken. In days. She retreated, closing the screen door but leaving the solid inner door open. She sat on the floor just inside, her knees pulled to her chest, and she watched him through the mesh. He didn't move toward the food immediately. He was cautious. His nose twitched, sampling the air, the rich, salty scent of the tuna. He looked from the food to her, a shadowy figure inside the house. His gaze was assessing, intelligent. He was calculating the risk. Finally, hunger won out over fear. He began his laborious journey across the porch. The scrape thump was softer now on the wooden boards, but it still made her chest ache. Every movement was a monument to effort. He reached the plate. He lowered his head, sniffed once, and then began to eat. It wasn't a frantic, starving gobble. It was slow, almost polite. As if he'd once known kindness and was remembering its manners. The sound of his eating, the small, soft crunches, was the only sound in the world. Ilara realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly, a long, quiet sigh that matched the ones he'd been making on the steps. He ate every last shred of tuna. He then turned to the water bowl and drank, his tiny pink tongue lapping with a quiet, efficient rhythm. When he was done, he didn't look at her. He didn't try to come inside. He simply turned his broken body and performed his slow, three-point turn, and then made his way back across the porch, down the steps, and disappeared into the dark blanket of the night. Ilara stayed on the floor for a long time after he was gone. The empty plate and half-empty water bowl sat on the porch like evidence of a dream. The air, for the first time all evening, felt lighter. The crushing weight on her chest had eased, just a fraction. She had done one small, good thing. It was a pebble dropped into the stagnant pond of her life, and the ripples were still moving outward. The next evening, as the light began to bleed from violet to deep blue, she found herself watching the clock. A low, quiet thrum of anticipation had replaced the usual dread that accompanied the day's end. She reheated leftover pasta she didn't taste, her ear tuned to the outside world, and then she heard it. Softer tonight, less desperate. The familiar scrape-thump. Her heart did a little flip. He was back. She had the tuna ready. Same plate, same bowl of fresh water. She placed it on the porch in the same spot. This time, she didn't retreat to the floor inside. She sat on the top porch step a few feet away from the food, her arms wrapped around her knees. She wanted to see if he would come anyway. If her presence, not just her food, was becoming something he could tolerate. He emerged from the bushes, his ginger fur a dull glow in the twilight. He saw her immediately. He stopped his forward motion. He froze, one paw lifted, his body tense, his eyes locked on hers. It was a standoff. The hum of a distant lawnmower, the chirp of crickets, it all faded away. Ilara didn't move. She tried to make her body look small, non-threatening. She remembered reading something about slow blinking at cats. It was a gesture of trust in their language. So, feeling utterly ridiculous and deeply sincere, she looked at him and slowly, deliberately, closed her eyes and opened them again. She wasn't sure what she expected. For him to bolt, maybe. But he didn't. He just watched her. A long moment passed, and then, astonishingly, he did it back. His wide green eyes held hers, and he gave a slow, deliberate blink. It was so clear, so unmistakable, that a shocked little laugh escaped her. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. Encouraged, he continued his approach. He was still cautious, but the sheer, exhausting terror of the previous night was gone. He ate his tuna. She sat on the step and watched him. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was a conversation. This became their ritual, their quiet, nightly communion. As the thick heat of late summer began to loosen its grip, giving way to the crisp, metallic tang of autumn nights, they settled into a routine. She would wait for the sound of him. He would appear at the edge of the yard, a small, determined ghost, and make his painful journey to the porch. She'd have his dinner waiting. Sometimes tuna, sometimes a bit of plain chicken she'd cooked for herself and set aside for him. She started talking to him. Not in a baby voice, but just talking. She told him about her day, the mindless data entry she did from home, the frustrating client, the way the light hit the maple tree in the backyard at 4 p.m. She told him things she hadn't told anyone else. She whispered her fears into the evening air, the fear that she'd be alone forever, the fear that David had been right about her, the fear that this aching loneliness was her permanent state. The cat would eat, his ears twitching slightly, and she liked to believe he was listening, that he was taking some of the weight of her words and carrying them away for her. She started calling him Trip. It was the first name that came to her, watching his lurching, three-legged gait. It stuck. She began to notice the small, specific things about him. The way his one good back leg was getting stronger, more muscular, from bearing all the weight. The way the white fur on his chest was finally starting to look clean and bright. The way he would sometimes, after finishing his meal, sit and meticulously wash his face with his one good front paw, his rough tongue rasping against his fur. He would groom with a fierce, focused concentration, as if trying to put his entire world back in order, one lick at a time. She bought him a cheap fleece blanket from a discount store and folded it into a cardboard box, creating a makeshift bed. She placed it in the corner of the porch, near the door, where it would be protected from the wind. The first night she put it out, she held her breath. He approached it with deep suspicion, circling it twice, sniffing every inch. He looked at her, chirped his question mark sound, and then, to her astonishment, he climbed in. He turned 3 times, a slow, painful pirouette, and then settled down into a tight loaf, his green eyes closing to contented slits. The purr started. Low, a rusty engine turning over after years of disuse. It was a quiet, thrumming vibration that seemed to fill the entire porch, seeping through the screen door and into Alara's own bones. She cried that night, silently, sitting on the kitchen floor. They were not tears of sadness. They were something else entirely. Have you ever had an animal wait for you even when you didn't ask them to? Not demand, not beg. Just wait. With a patience that feels deeper than any human patience you've ever known. It's a humbling thing. It makes you want to become the person they already seem to think you are. Weeks bled into a month. The autumn air grew sharp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Alara found herself living for the evenings. The empty hours of the day were just something to get through until she could hear the scrape thump on her porch steps. She bought a better brand of cat food. She put a warmer blanket in the box. She found herself cleaning the house more, opening the blinds to let the sun in. The echoing rooms started to feel less like a tomb and more like a house waiting for something. Or someone. And then came the night of the first real frost. Alara could feel it coming. The air had a bite that promised ice by morning. She'd put an old electric heating pad under Trip's blanket, set on low, and she worried it was too much, that he'd be scared of the faint warmth. She waited for him, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. When he came, his fur was dusted with tiny, glittering crystals. He moved more stiffly than usual, the cold clearly seizing his damaged leg, making his movements even more jerky and painful. He ate his dinner quickly, seeking the calories for warmth. When he was done, he didn't go straight to his box. He turned and looked at her. She was sitting on her usual step, a thick sweater pulled tight around her. He took a step toward her, then another. He stopped about a foot away, well within touching distance. This was new. He had never come this close, without the incentive of food. He looked at her, and then he looked pointedly at the door, then back at her. Her breath caught in her throat. She understood. The porch, even with its heated pad, wasn't enough. The wild, independent creature was asking for more. He was asking to come in. He took one more hop forward. He was so close now she could see the individual white whiskers sprinkled among the orange ones on his muzzle. She could smell the cold night air on his fur. He lowered his head, not in defeat, but in a gesture of profound vulnerability. And then he did it. He leaned forward, ever so slightly, and pressed the top of his head against her knee. It was the lightest touch. A whisper of warmth and fur against the denim of her jeans. It lasted for less than a second, but it was everything. It was a seismic shift. It was a signature on a contract of trust. He immediately pulled back, as if startled by his own bravery. He gave her one long, unblinking look, his green eyes wide and solemn. Then he turned and, with a new determination, hopped into his box, curled up on the warm blanket and began to purr, the sound louder and more confident than ever before. Alara sat frozen on the step, the ghost of his touch burning on her knee. She looked at the closed door, then back at the cat. now sleeping peacefully on the porch, trusting her to keep him safe from the cold. The line between her inside and his outside had just been irrevocably blurred. The bridge had been crossed, not by her, but by him. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he wouldn't be on the porch for much longer. The morning after the frost, the morning after he'd pressed his head against her knee, Alara woke with a new kind of urgency humming in her veins. It was a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't the frantic, anxious energy she'd grown accustomed to. This was purpose. The house was cold, a deep, penetrating chill that had seeped through the old windowsills, overnight. Her first thought wasn't for herself, for her own coffee, for the bleakness of another empty day. It was for the porch, for the box, for him. She pulled on her robe, her fingers fumbling with the tie, and practically ran to the back door, her heart a drum in her ears. She was afraid of what she'd find, afraid the cold had been too much, that the trust he'd shown had been a final fleeting gesture before something terrible happened. She peered through the glass of the inner door, her breath fogging the pain. The box was empty, the blanket was rumpled, the shape of his body still pressed into it, but he was gone. A wave of cold disappointment, so sharp it felt like physical pain, washed over her. He'd left. Of course he'd left. He was a creature of the wild, despite his broken body, and her porch was just a pit stop. The connection she'd felt, the seismic shift, it had been one-sided, a fantasy she'd built in her own loneliness. She unlocked the door and stepped out onto the porch, the cold wood biting through her thin socks. The world was encased in a glittering, silent frost. Every blade of grass, every fallen leaf, every spiderweb on the railing was outlined in brilliant, fragile white. It was beautiful and heartbreaking. She reached into the box. The heating pad was still faintly warm. He hadn't been gone long. And then she saw it. Lying right in the center of the rumpled blanket, placed with a deliberateness that couldn't be accidental, was a single, perfect feather. It was small, a soft gray downy feather, the kind that sits closest to a bird's skin for warmth. It was clean and pristine, untouched by the frost. It looked like it had been placed there, carefully, like a gift on a pillow. Alara picked it up. It was impossibly soft, almost weightless in her palm. She held it, staring at it, the cold forgotten. Why was this here? Had it just blown in? But the night had been still, windless. The box was sheltered, and it was centered so perfectly. It felt intentional. She heard the sound then. The familiar scrape thump, but it was distant, coming from the far end of the yard near the old oak tree. She looked up, her eyes scanning the frosted landscape, and there he was. Trip. He was moving away from the house, his gait determined, heading toward the thick line of bushes that separated her property from the woods beyond. He wasn't looking back. She almost called out to him. She wanted to say, "Wait," or "Thank you," or "Where are you going?" But the words died in her throat. This was his time. His life existed in a sphere she wasn't yet part of. She just watched him until he disappeared into the brush, the frost-covered branches swallowing his ginger form whole. She went back inside, the feather clutched in her hand. She placed it on the kitchen windowsill, a tiny, strange artifact. A question mark. She spent the day distracted, her eyes constantly drifting to the feather. It was just a feather, but it felt like a message in a language she didn't know how to read. That evening, he returned right on time, as the sun was bleeding, orange behind the skeletal trees. The routine was the same, the food, the water, her sitting on the step. But something was different. He ate, but he was distracted. His ears were constantly swiveling, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. He finished his meal quickly and then, instead of settling into his box for a long groom or a nap, he sat by the steps and looked at her. He let out a soft, urgent chirp. Then he turned and looked out into the darkening yard, back at her. Chirp. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. "What's out there?" He chirped again, a sound that was somehow both questioning and answering. Then, with a resolve that seemed to steel his entire body, he turned and hopped off, The porch, heading back in the same direction he'd gone that morning. He paused at the edge of the lawn and looked back at her one more time. An invitation? A farewell? She couldn't tell. The next day, he was gone from the box before dawn again. And again, when she went out to check, shivering in the cold morning air, there was another offering. This time, it was a smooth, river-washed stone, dark gray, and shot through with a single thin vein of white quartz. It was cold and heavy in her hand. It felt important. She placed it on the windowsill next to the feather. The pattern was established. Each morning he was gone before first light. Each morning, she would find a small, seemingly worthless treasure left in his bed. A curl of silver birch bark. A brilliantly red maple leaf, perfectly preserved. A single, discarded blue jay feather, more vibrant than any she'd ever seen. Her days, which had once been an indistinguishable blur of grief and silence, now had a new rhythm, a new mystery to solve. She found herself waking up earlier, not with dread, but with a quiet excitement to see what he had brought her. The collection on her windowsill grew, a small, curated museum of the natural world. She started researching, trying to understand. Was this a behavior? Were stray cats known to bring gifts to humans? The articles she found were vague, talking about cats presenting owners with dead prey as a teaching mechanism or a sign of affection. But this was different. These weren't dead things. They were beautiful things, carefully selected things. It felt like he was trying to tell her something, to show her something. But what? The worry began to curdle the edges of her curiosity. Where was he going all day? His territory, she knew, couldn't be large, not with his mobility issues. The effort it must take for him to travel, to find these objects, to carry them back. It was staggering to contemplate. She started noticing new things. The pads of his one good front paw were becoming rough, almost calloused. Sometimes he'd come back in the evenings with tiny burrs caught in the fur of his chest, or a faint, earthy smell of mud on him, as if he'd been digging. One afternoon, a cold rain set in, a relentless, dreary drizzle that iced the bare branches and turned the yard to mud. Alara was sick with worry. He was out there in this. His fur wasn't thick, not like a winter cat's should be. He'd be soaked, chilled to the bone. His leg would be agony in the damp cold. She stood at the back door for hours, watching the rain sheet down, her forehead pressed against the cool glass. She thought about going out to look for him, but where would she even start? The woods were vast, and he was so small. He didn't come back that evening. The light faded, the gray twilight turning to a black, rain-soaked night. His food sat untouched on the porch, the rain slowly turning it to a soggy, unappetizing mush. Alara didn't eat either. She sat in the dark living room, listening to the drum of rain on the roof, each drop sounding like a tiny accusation. She had let him in. She had let herself care. And now he was gone. Probably hurt, or worse. And it was her fault for not doing more, for not bringing him inside weeks ago. The old familiar weight of failure settled back onto her shoulders, heavier than ever. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? That they can sense the cracks in our foundation? Maybe they do. Or maybe it's just that when we're broken ourselves, we're finally open enough to see the world not as a series of problems to be solved, but as a series of mysteries to be lived. Alara's mystery was out in the freezing rain, and the not knowing was a special kind of torture. The rain finally stopped just after midnight. The sudden silence was jarring. Alara must have fallen into a fitful, anxious sleep on the couch, because the sound woke her. It wasn't the silence that woke her, though. It was another sound, a sound she knew better than her own heartbeat. Scrape. Thump. It was slower than usual. Heavier. Labored. She scrambled off the couch, her heart in her throat, and ran to the door, fumbling for the lock. She yanked it open. Trip was there, at the bottom of the porch steps. He was a pitiful sight. He was caked in mud from his ears to his tail, his ginger fur plastered dark and heavy to his skin. He was shivering violently, his whole body trembling with the effort to simply stay upright. He looked up at her, and his green eyes were wide, not with exhaustion this time, but with something else. Something like panic. Urgency. He tried to climb the steps, but his mud-clogged paws slipped on the wet wood. He fell back with a soft, defeated thud. He let out a sound then, a sound she had never heard from him before. It was a low, guttural yowl, filled with a distress that was so raw, so palpable, it felt like a physical blow. He wasn't just coming back for food or shelter. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He looked at her, yowled again, and then, with a tremendous effort, he turned his body away from the porch, away from the safety and warmth she represented. He looked back at her, that desperate cry tearing from his throat again, and then he began to drag his broken, mud-soaked body back into the dark, wet yard. He wasn't asking for help for himself. He was trying to lead her somewhere. That sound, that guttural, torn from the depths yowl, it wasn't a sound of pain. It was a sound of pleading. It sliced through the last of Alara's sleepiness, through her fear, through her own wall of grief, and hooked something primal deep inside her. He wasn't just hurt. He was trying to tell her something. He was already several feet into the yard, his mud-caked body a dark smudge against the wet grass, moving with a frantic, determined energy she'd never seen in him. Every movement was a struggle, a slip, a shudder. But he kept going, pausing only to look back at her, his eyes glowing emeralds in the profound darkness. "Okay," she breathed, the word a puff of steam in the frigid air. "Okay, I'm coming." She didn't stop for shoes. She didn't stop for a coat. She just plunged off the porch steps, her bare feet sinking into the icy, waterlogged earth. The cold was a shock, 1,000 needles shooting up through her soles, but she barely registered it. Her entire world had narrowed to the desperate, retreating form of the cat and the path he was cutting through the night. The backyard was a minefield of puddles and slick mud. Her feet slid out from under her once, and she landed hard on her knees, the cold wetness instantly soaking through her thin pajama pants. She scrambled back up, her eyes locked on Trip. He was still moving, still calling to her with those ragged, urgent yowls. He was leading her toward the old oak tree at the back of the property, and then beyond it, to the thick, tangled line of bushes that marked the beginning of the woods. This was farther than she'd ever seen him go. The effort it must have cost, him every single day, to make this journey. Her throat tightened. This was his pilgrimage. And tonight, she was finally being invited. He disappeared into the brush. Alara pushed through after him, thorny branches grabbing at her clothes and hair, scratching her arms. The air under the canopy was even colder, smelling of damp rot and wet leaves. It was pitch black. She could barely see her own hands in front of her face. She could only hear him, the relentless scrape thump ahead of her, a beacon in the overwhelming dark. "Trip?" she called out, her voice small and swallowed by the trees. "I'm here, boy. I'm right here." He yowled in response, closer than she expected. She pushed forward another few feet, and the brush suddenly thinned. They were in a small, hidden clearing, a place she'd never known existed, sheltered by a fallen log and a thicket of hawthorn. The faint light of a half-moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the scene in soft, monochrome detail. And there he was. Trip had stopped. He was sitting next to the fallen log, his body trembling not just from cold now, but from sheer exhaustion. He looked at her, and then he looked down at a specific spot at the base of the log. He let out one last soft mew, a sound of arrival, a sound of, "Here." Alara stumbled forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. What was she going to find? Another animal? Something injured? Something dead? The possibilities, each more terrible than the last, flashed through her mind. She knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the wet leaf litter. The cold was seeping into her bones, but she ignored it. She followed his gaze to the base of the log. It was dark, a cavity hidden by roots and shadows. At first, she saw nothing, just blackness. And then she heard it. A tiny, almost imperceptible sound. A faint, high-pitched squeaking, like a rusty hinge swinging in a gentle breeze. Her breath caught. She leaned closer, peering into the darkness. There, nestled in a shallow, carefully dug depression lined with dry leaves and, her heart stopped with tufts of familiar orange and white fur, was a tiny squirming pile of life. 5 of them. 5 impossibly small, blind kittens. Their eyes were sealed shut, their bodies no bigger than her thumb. They were wriggling, letting out those frail, desperate squeaks, the universal sound of hunger and cold. And standing over them, her body positioned between them and the world, was another cat, a slender tortoiseshell female. She was staring at Alara with wide, terrified eyes, every muscle in her body tense. She was skin and bones, even more emaciated than Trip had been. Her fur was matted, and she was shivering violently. But she didn't run. She stood her ground, a low, warning growl rumbling in her chest, a final, feeble defense of her babies. Alara understood everything in a single, breathtaking, heart-shattering instant. The gifts, the feathers, the soft bark, the beautiful leaf. He hadn't been bringing them to her. He'd been taking them from her. He'd been scavenging them from her porch, from her yard, and bringing them here. For her. For this mother. For this nest. The river stone? A weight to hold down the lining. The birch bark, insulation, the feathers, the softest bedding for the most vulnerable creatures on Earth. He hadn't been leaving her at dawn. He'd been coming here, to do this, to provide, to care for a family that wasn't even his own. This broken, three-legged creature, who could barely care for himself, had taken on the monumental responsibility of keeping 5 other lives alive. The long absences, the burrs, the mud, the exhaustion. It all made a terrible, beautiful sense. And the mother, she was starving. She was too weak to hunt, too terrified to leave her kittens for long. She was relying on him, on Trip. And Trip, in his own desperate way, had been relying on Alara. He hadn't been asking for help for himself. Not really. Every piece of tuna, every bowl of food she'd given him, every ounce of strength he'd regained on her porch, he'd been converting it into energy for this daily journey. He'd been taking the fuel she gave him and using it to sustain this hidden family. He was a bridge, a lifeline. And tonight, in the freezing rain, the system had broken down. The mother was too cold. The kittens were too cold. He was too cold. His secret was failing. And so he'd done the only thing he could. He'd come to her. He'd begged. He'd led her to the heart of his world and shown her the truth. A sob broke from Alara's chest, a raw, uncontrollable sound that echoed in the silent clearing. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred her vision, streaming down her cold cheeks. She wasn't just crying for the cats. She was crying for the sheer, overwhelming beauty of it. For the trust. For the impossible, selfless love radiating from this broken animal. He had seen her own brokenness and had, in his own way, been trying to mend it by letting her help him mend something else. She looked at Trip. He was watching her, his green eyes wide and solemn. His job was done. He had delivered his message. He slowly, painfully, lowered his head onto his paws, his body finally giving out, his energy completely spent. The trust was now in her hands. The mother cat was still growling, a thin, reedy sound of pure fear. "Shh," Alara whispered, her voice thick with tears. She slowly, so slowly, reached out a trembling hand. Not toward the kittens. Not toward the mother. Toward Trip. She laid her hand gently on his wet, muddy head. He didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, a faint, thrumming purr starting up in his chest. It was a sound of absolute, total relief. She kept her hand on him, her anchor in the storm of her emotions. She looked at the mother cat, at her terrified eyes. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice soft and steady, though she was shaking from head to toe. "I see you. I see all of you. I'm here to help." She looked at the squirming, squeaking kittens. They wouldn't last the night out here. None of them would. The mother was too weak to produce enough milk. The cold was a killer. With a resolve that felt both terrifying and iron-strong, Alara made a decision. She carefully, gently, shrugged off her thin, soaked pajama top. She was shivering in her tank top now, the cold air biting her skin. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but this. She reached forward, moving with a slowness that felt glacial, and began to gently, so gently, gather the kittens into the soft, fleecy inside of her pajama top. The mother cat tensed, her growl intensifying, but she didn't attack. She watched, her eyes huge, as Alara bundled her 5 babies into a warm, soft nest. "I'm taking them somewhere warm," Alara murmured to her. "Somewhere safe. You can come too. Please, come too." She stood up, cradling the squeaking bundle against her chest. The warmth of their tiny bodies seeped through the fabric into her skin. She looked down at Trip. "Can you make it, my brave boy? Can you follow me home?" As if he understood every word, he struggled to his feet. He was swaying with exhaustion, but he looked at her, and he gave a slow, determined blink. Alara turned and began to walk back through the woods, her bare feet numb on the cold ground, holding the 5 most precious things in the world against her heart. She didn't look back. She could hear it, the scrape thump right behind her. And a moment later, the soft, hesitant patter of a 4th set of paws. The mother was following. Tears still streamed down Alara's face, but she was smiling, a real, true, aching smile that stretched muscles long forgotten. She finally understood. All of it. The lonely nights on the porch, the shared silence, the gifts. It had never been about her saving him. It had always been about him leading her back to herself. He had brought her the broken pieces of his world, not as a burden, but as an invitation to help him build something beautiful. And in doing so, he had shown her that her own broken pieces could be used to build something beautiful too. She finally saw what he had been trying to tell her all along. That love isn't about being whole. It's about showing up, broken leg and all, for someone else who is broken, and building a nest together in the dark. The walk back to the house through the freezing, pitch-black woods was a pilgrimage in reverse. Alara, cradling the squeaking bundle of kittens against her chest, her bare feet numb and cut, led a procession of the broken and the saved. The scrape thump of Trip's determined gait was her metronome, her proof that this was real. Behind him, soft as a ghost, came the mother cat, her fear momentarily overruled by a primal need to follow her babies. The world was reduced to the circle of moonlight on the path, the sound of their movement, and the fragile warmth against Alara's heart. She pushed through the final line of brush, and her backyard opened up. The porch light she'd left on casting. A golden, welcoming pool onto the wet grass. It looked like a different planet. A safe planet. She didn't stop on the porch. She went straight to the back door, nudged it open with her shoulder, and stepped into her kitchen. The warmth hit her first. A dry, enveloping heat that made her shivering body convulse. She stood there, dripping mud and rain and leaves onto the clean linoleum, and for a second, she was paralyzed. What now? The enormity of it all. 5 newborn kittens, a feral mother, an exhausted Trip, crashed over her. Trip solved the first problem. He followed her inside, his paws leaving muddy prints next to her own. He didn't pause to explore or smell. He walked straight to the corner of the kitchen, near the radiator, and collapsed onto the floor with a heavy sigh, his mission accomplished. His eyes were already closing. He was home. The mother cat hesitated at the threshold, her body a tense line of fear. She peered inside, her eyes wide, her nose twitching at the unfamiliar smells of cleaner and human food. She looked at Alara, at the bundle in her arms, and then at Trip, sleeping peacefully on the floor. That seemed to decide it. She slunk inside, low to the ground, and immediately darted under the kitchen table, a shadow seeking deeper shadows. "Okay," Alara whispered to herself, her breath starting to come in shaky gasps. "Okay, think." She moved quickly. She laid the bundled pajama top with the kittens still nestled inside, on the floor near the radiator, close to Trip. He opened one eye, gave a slow blink of approval, and went back to sleep. Alara grabbed every towel and blanket she could find from the hallway closet, old, soft things she'd been meaning to donate. She fashioned a large, deep nest in the corner, lining it with towels. She needed to get the kittens warm, properly warm. She gently transferred them, one by one, into the new nest. They were so tiny, their mews so faint. The mother cat watched from under the table, her eyes glowing. Alara knew she needed to get the mom to them, to let them nurse. But she also knew she couldn't force it. She opened a new can of the expensive cat food, the really smelly kind, and placed it in a bowl right next to the nest of kittens. Then, she backed away, giving space. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped together, and she waited. She didn't look directly at the mother cat. She just waited. The smell of the food was too powerful. A low, hungry moan came from under the table. Slowly, tentatively, the tortoiseshell head emerged. She slunk toward the food bowl, her eyes darting everywhere. She reached it, and she began to eat, a frantic, starving gobble that was so different from Trip's polite manners. She ate until the bowl was clean. She licked it twice, and then, her hunger sated, her instincts took over. She turned to the squirming pile of kittens, sniffed them carefully, and then, with a soft, trilling sound, she stepped into the nest and laid down, curling her body around them. The kittens immediately found her and began to nurse, their frantic squeaks softening into contented murmurs. Alara let out a sob of relief. She put her face in her hands and cried, her shoulders shaking. They were safe. All of them. For now. The storm had passed. But in its wake, everything was different. The quiet, echoing house was quiet no more. It was filled with the soft rustle of blankets, the tiny sounds of nursing, the deep rumbling purr of a mother cat, and the steady rhythmic breathing of a three-legged ginger cat sleeping the sleep of the just. Alara didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold, watching over her newfound family. She was their sentry. She was their guardian. The weight she had carried for so long was still there, but it had transformed. It was no longer the crushing weight of grief. It was the solid, grounding weight of responsibility, of being needed. The days that followed were a blur of gentle chaos. A trip to the vet for everyone, worming medicine, checks for the kittens, a proper look at Trip's leg. The vet confirmed it was an old healed break, untreatable but not causing him pain, and a slow, patient process of earning the trust of the mother cat, who Alara named Bella. Trips to the pet store for formula, just in case, for more food, for a proper litter box. The rhythm of her life was completely rewritten. Mornings were no longer about dragging herself out of bed. They were about the urgent, tiny mews of kittens needing to be fed. Her days were filled with the quiet joy of watching Bella slowly relax, her body filling out, her fur growing soft and glossy. She started venturing out from under the table, first to eat, then to sit in a patch of sun, then to cautiously rub against Alara's legs while she made coffee. And Trip was the king of this new soft world. He was the constant. He slept near the kitten nest, a protective ginger sentinel. He would greet Alara in the mornings with a headbutt to her ankle and a loud rumbling purr. His three-legged walk became the most familiar and comforting sound. In the house, the soft thud-drag-thud of him moving from room to room, checking on his kingdom. He had given up his wild freedom, and in return, he had gained a family. He had always been their provider. Now, he could just be their guardian. Their friend. Alara found herself talking to them all the time. She'd tell Bella about the book she was reading. She'd tell the kittens about the clouds outside the window. She'd tell Trip about her work, her silly frustrations, her small joys. The house was no longer an echo chamber of her own loneliness. It was a conversation. The kittens grew. Their eyes opened, revealing tiny blue marbles that would later change to green, like their mothers. They became little wobble butts, stumbling around the kitchen, chasing dust motes in the sunbeams. Trip was endlessly patient with them. They would climb over him, bat at his tail, and bite his ears. He would just lie there and purr, occasionally giving one a gentle, cleansing lick with his rough tongue. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after, that night in the woods, Alara was sitting on the kitchen floor, surrounded by tumbling, playing kittens. Bella was perched on a chair, watching with regal amusement. Trip was stretched out beside her, his head in her lap, as he often did now. She was laughing. A real, full, unforced laugh as one of the kittens, a brave little orange one, tried to attack her shoelace. She looked around at this scene, this messy, chaotic, beautiful scene of life that had exploded into her existence. She thought of the woman she was just a few months ago, the one who flinched at sounds, who lived in the dark, who believed her life was over. She wasn't that woman anymore. The grief for her marriage was still there, But it was no longer a boulder she was carrying. It was a stone in her pocket, smooth from handling, its sharp edges worn away. It was a part of her history, but it wasn't her entire present. Her present was here, on this sun-warmed floor, filled with purrs and life. She looked down at Trip, who was gazing up at her, his green eyes half closed in contentment. She stroked the soft fur between his ears. "You did this, you know," she whispered to him. "You crazy, beautiful, three-legged miracle. You brought me back to life." He responded by stretching his head up and pressing the top of his skull firmly into the palm of her hand. It was his signature move, his gesture of ultimate trust and love. It was a feeling she would never get used to, a gift that never diminished. As the weeks turned into months, the kittens grew into sturdy, adoptable little cats. Alara found good, vetted homes for 4 of them, a process that was bittersweet but right. She kept the brave little orange one, the shoelace attacker, who she named Finn. Bella, no longer feral but a devoted indoor queen, decided she quite liked this life of regular meals and warm radiators. Finn and his mother became permanent fixtures, a playful duo who brought endless entertainment. But Trip was different. He was her heart cat, the one who had seen her at her absolute lowest and had not looked away. He had, instead, presented her with a problem so much bigger than her own that it forced her to look outward, to engage, to love again. His favorite thing was to sit with her on the porch in the evenings, just as they used to. But now, he sat on the porch swing next to her, curled in her lap, his purr a motor against her legs. They would watch the fireflies, together in a comfortable silence that needed no words. One evening, as summer was once again painting the world in deep green and gold, they were sitting there. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of honeysuckle. Finn and Bella were chasing moths in the yard. Alara was stroking Trip's back, feeling the familiar, misshapen architecture of his hip under her fingers. She wasn't thinking about the past anymore. She was just present, in this perfect, quiet moment. Trip lifted his head from her lap. He looked out into the yard, and then he looked up at her. He chirped, that old, familiar question mark sound. He hopped down from the swing and onto the porch. He turned and looked back at her, just as he had on that freezing night months ago. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he was leaving, that his work was done and he was returning to the wild. But he didn't go down the steps. Instead, he walked to the far corner of the porch, to the spot where his old cardboard box and blanket had once been. He nosed around in the shadows for a moment, and then he turned and began to walk back to her. In his mouth, he carried something. Her breath caught. It was happening again. The gift. After all this time, he hopped back onto the swing and dropped it into her lap. It wasn't a feather or a stone. It was a small, weathered, much-chewed toy mouse, one of Finn's favorites, lost for weeks. It was a ridiculous, mundane thing, a piece of stuffed felt with plastic eyes. But as she picked it up, she understood. This wasn't a gift for a provider. This wasn't a payment for services rendered. This was a gift for a friend. This was him saying, "I found this thing that belongs to our family, and I brought it back to you." It was an inside joke, a token of shared domesticity. It was the most profound gift he had ever given her. She held the little toy mouse in her hand, and she looked into his wise green eyes, and she knew. Love isn't about the grand gesture. It's not about being whole and perfect and having everything to give. It's about showing up with whatever you have, however broken you are, and offering it. A piece of tuna, a perfect feather, a chewed-up toy mouse, a trusted secret. It's about building a bridge, piece by piece, across the darkness between two souls, until you meet in the middle and realize you were never alone to begin with. She pulled Trip into her lap again, holding the silly toy mouse in one hand and stroking her miraculous cat with the other. The purr started up again, a vibration that felt like it was healing something deep inside her, something she hadn't even known was still broken. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart. Subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.